There is a quiet habit of keeping anticipation low. Not pessimism, not indifference, just restraint. Hopes are softened before they grow. Excitement is tempered early. Expectations are adjusted downward as a precaution. The future is approached carefully, as if enthusiasm itself carried risk. People who avoid creating expectations often don't see this as avoidance. They describe it as realism, as emotional balance, as a way to stay grounded. By not expecting too much, disappointment can be managed in advance. Outcomes feel easier to accept. The emotional range stays contained. Nothing rises too high, so nothing can fall too far. In everyday life, this shows up subtly. Good news is received calmly. Promising situations are met with caution. Positive possibilities are acknowledged but not fully embraced. There is a tendency to say, "we'll see," instead of "this could be great." Not because excitement isn't felt, but because it's held back intentionally. Because this approach often prevents visible distress, it's rarely questioned. The person appears composed, stable, hard to shake. Avoiding expectations feels like maturity, like having learned not to get carried away. But beneath that composure, something quieter is happening. The future is being experienced at a distance, before it even arrives. And over time, anticipation itself begins to feel unfamiliar. Hope is present, but muted. Possibility exists, but stays abstract. The question that slowly forms isn't "what if it goes wrong?" but "what happens when nothing is allowed to matter too much?" This pattern is often rooted in protection rather than lack of desire. Avoiding expectations becomes a way to regulate emotional exposure. When anticipation is kept low, outcomes feel easier to absorb. Disappointment arrives smaller. Letdown feels familiar. The system stays steady. From a psychological perspective, this is not detachment, it is containment. Over time, the mind learns to associate expectation with vulnerability. Wanting something too much creates tension. Hoping openly introduces uncertainty. By lowering expectations early, emotional impact is spread out and controlled. The future becomes something to approach cautiously, not enthusiastically. Safety is preserved, even if excitement is reduced. Behaviorally, this shows up as restraint in expression. Plans are discussed without emphasis. Opportunities are acknowledged without investment. Compliments are deflected. Promises are met with neutrality. The person appears calm and grounded, while internally maintaining distance from outcomes. Nothing is rejected outright. It is simply not fully welcomed. As this repeats, expectation avoidance becomes automatic. The mind edits enthusiasm before it reaches awareness. Anticipation is interrupted early, not because it's false, but because it feels risky. And slowly, the emotional system adapts to a narrower range, one where stability is maintained, but upward movement feels unfamiliar. There is a moment when this avoidance becomes most visible. It usually appears right before something genuinely promising. A possibility opens. A plan begins to feel real. The future briefly pulls forward, and almost immediately the internal response shifts toward caution. The mind lowers the volume. It introduces distance. Excitement is moderated before it can settle. From a psychological perspective, this happens because expectation creates emotional momentum. Once something is allowed to matter, the system prepares for impact, positive or negative. For people who learned early that outcomes are uncertain or fragile, that preparation feels costly. Hope requires exposure. Exposure invites loss. So the system intervenes early, not to stop the possibility, but to reduce its emotional weight. Behaviorally, this results in a familiar posture. Opportunities are approached halfway. Optimism is qualified. Language becomes conditional. Maybe replaces when. If it happens, replaces "I'm looking forward to it." The future is kept provisional. Nothing is fully claimed. Over time, this creates a subtle internal contradiction. The desire for something better remains, but the willingness to lean into it does not. The person wants change, but avoids the emotional stretch that change demands. Expectation is kept at arm's length, close enough to acknowledge, far enough to avoid being moved by it. And slowly the habit reinforces itself. Not expecting becomes safer than hoping. As this pattern settles in, it begins to shape how time is experienced. The future feels flatter, not empty, but muted. Events arrive without much emotional buildup, and when they pass, they leave little residue. Life moves forward, yet anticipation rarely pulls the person toward it. Everything is approached with a steady, careful neutrality. From a psychological standpoint, expectation gives structure to time. Anticipation creates emotional landmarks, moments the mind leans toward. When expectations are consistently restrained, those landmarks fade. Days feel orderly but less textured. The person functions well, yet rarely feels carried by momentum. Stability is preserved, but at the cost of forward emotional movement. Emotionally, this creates a controlled range. Joy is felt, but briefly. Satisfaction arrives, but quietly. The system avoids peaks to prevent valleys. Over time, this can create a sense that life is happening at a distance, not because things don't matter, but because they are prevented from mattering too much. Nothing appears broken from the outside. The person seems mature, balanced, reasonable, but internally something is being managed constantly. Hope is filtered, excitement is negotiated. The future is kept emotionally light, not to avoid life, but to survive it with minimal impact. Over time, this emotional restraint begins to influence identity. The person starts to see themselves as someone who doesn't get carried away, someone practical. Someone who keeps expectations realistic. The self-image feels protective. It explains the calm. It justifies the distance. And it makes the avoidance of anticipation feel intentional rather than automatic. But psychologically, identity formed around emotional control often hides a quiet trade-off. By limiting expectation, the system also limits investment. Experiences are lived but lightly. Outcomes are accepted but rarely integrated deeply. The person adapts to a life where disappointment is manageable, but so is fulfillment. This can create a subtle internal dullness. Not sadness, not emptiness, more like a reduced emotional contrast. Moments that could feel meaningful arrive without tension beforehand and pass without resonance afterward. The system stays stable, but something vital feels absent. The sense of being pulled forward by possibility. Behaviorally, this shows up as hesitation to name desires clearly. Goals remain flexible. Dreams are described cautiously. The future is kept adjustable, so it never fully claims the person. Avoiding expectations becomes a way to avoid being emotionally displaced by outcomes, even positive ones. And slowly, the question shifts, not what if it fails, but what happens if nothing is ever fully hoped for. The most important shift begins when avoiding expectations is no longer seen as wisdom, but as a strategy. Not a conscious choice, but a learned response to uncertainty. The system learned that hope carries weight, and weight can hurt. So anticipation was softened, not eliminated, just enough to stay safe. When this is recognized, expectation takes on a different role. It stops being a threat and becomes information. Wanting something doesn't demand that it work out. Anticipating doesn't guarantee disappointment. It simply means allowing the future to matter, even temporarily. Psychologically, expectation is not about outcome control. It's about emotional engagement. Without it, experiences remain shallow. The system avoids pain, but also avoids depth. And depth is what creates meaning over time. There is no instruction here to hope more or risk everything. The shift begins with awareness, noticing when excitement is reduced automatically, when anticipation is corrected before it grows, when neutrality replaces interest without being chosen. It may be worth observing what expectation feels like in the body, where tension appears, what feels risking about wanting. In many cases, the difficulty isn't expecting, it's trusting that disappointment can be survived. Here, these patterns are observed calmly.